we talk about these divine appointments and these things that maybe God has begun to give us an opportunity for something. And Nehemiah maybe here was probing by answering the question in this way. Maybe he's had these times before the king, and the king just hasn't said anything. But now the king is saying something. Now the king's asking him a question. And God, is this an open door? I've been praying for 4 months. Is this the open door that you're offering me here? And so he appeals to the sympathy of the king. It was respect for ancestral homeland and ancestral burial grounds was very common, especially in the ancient Near East, especially among royalty and nobility. And Nehemiah, again, initially avoids mentioning that he wants to go back to Jerusalem. He says, the place where my fathers are buried, my ancestors are buried, it's in ruins, and I'm heartsick over it. And why wouldn't he just say, hey, I want to go back to Jerusalem? Well, there's probably a reason. When you go back to Ezra, you remember I mentioned last week that Ezra and Nehemiah in the Jewish Bible are one book, and to separate the two, to try to preach one without referencing the other is just really impossible. And when you go back to Ezra chapter 4, you'll find out that people in Jerusalem had tried to do a little bit of rebuilding of the wall, and they complained. People around them complained to King Artaxerxes, who Nehemiah is now standing before. They complained and said, hey, this is just a bunch of troublemakers. They've always been troublemakers. You can't let them build a wall again. And so the king said, he shut it down. He declared an edict, no more building, and it stopped it. And now here Nehemiah is saying, yeah, I want you to reverse what you said 20 years ago. Not quite 20 years ago. And so he's got, again, this diplomatic balancing act. But Nehemiah didn't back off because of fear. He'd spent too much time in prayer to back off because of fear. He was going to be able to stand on what Paul would later write to the church at Ephesus, that God can do immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine. He says, God can handle this. I don't have a reason to be afraid. I've been praying for 4 months. God's been leading me to this. I know it. And so now I understand what the writer of Proverbs 21:1 says, that a king's heart is like channeled water in the Lord's hand. He directs it wherever he chooses. And maybe this is the opportunity that this king, though he has said no more rebuilding in Jerusalem, maybe this is the opportunity for him to change his mind because the Lord is directing his heart somewhere different. And so the king asks him, what's your request? What's your request? And Nehemiah breathes just this quick, silent prayer. Quick, silent prayer, and we all know those prayers. We throw up flares all the time. But a quick prayer like this matters because of the months of prayer he'd put in beforehand. Quick prayers are possible and they're valid when one has prayed sufficiently beforehand. When one has that relationship with God, and God, here's this unexpected thing that's happening, and now will you see me through it? And so with that question, Nehemiah recognizes again this divine appointment, this time that God has given him before the king to ask what he desires to ask. And so he recognizes that God has initiated this plan, and when God initiates a plan, that there are no limits. I get the opportunity to stand before the king. God has given me this opportunity not just to serve him, not just to have this role to begin with, but I get a chance to stand before the king, and he asks me, what do I want? What is it that I want? He says, I recognize that God can do so much more than I can imagine. Do you believe that? Do you really believe that? Because Nehemiah did. He's going to test it out. He's going to ask for the extraordinary, and he's going to ask for something that only God could provide, and we're going to see in a moment that he's going to be provided with even more than he asked. One thing that stuck out to me was that Nehemiah didn't ask for permission to go back to Jerusalem. He didn't want to go back just to have a look around. He didn't want to go on some pilgrimage. Nehemiah knew he had work to do because the place that at one time was the glory of God was there. The temple was there. They've already rebuilt the temple at this point. Remember, it's not to where Solomon's temple had been. I mean, it's in the same spot, but didn't look the same. But God's people were disgraced, and they were being mocked by those around him. And Nehemiah said, I don't want to just go back and look around. I don't want to go back and offer advice. Look at what he says here. If it pleases the king and your servant has found favor with you, send me to Judah. Don't let me go back. Send me. Give me a purpose. I have a plan. God is giving me a vision for what should be going on there. Send me. It's almost this Isaiah 6:8 moment that Nehemiah himself is having here. He'd heard the reports. He knew the gravity of the situation. And he volunteers and says, God, let me be the one. Here I am. Send me. And he has to go to be sent with the full authority and the backing of the Persian Empire. I mean, he's not just, he's not, the Persian, they were the biggest and the baddest around at that time. He's not asking some other lowly servant who just happens to be higher than him to, hey, help me out with this. He's talking to the highest power on earth at that time from man's perspective. He says, send me to rebuild that which you previously forbade to be being rebuilt just because somebody convinced you that some people were troublesome. Send me to do this work that my God has placed in my heart. You don't know that God. You don't understand that God. You don't understand what's going on. But send me to do that. And then he says, oh yeah, and would you write some letters? Put your royal seal on them so that as I'm going, nobody gives me any trouble. Immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine. Well, he's imagined this. And then he wants permission, and Nehemiah's done his research. He knows the name of the guy that's in charge of the king's forest. He knows who that is, and he says, this guy, he's the one in charge. Give me a letter to him saying that you authorize me to cut down whatever timber I need to rebuild the gates, to work on the wall, and to build a house for myself. I got to live somewhere. And the king did it because God was with him. The king did it. And then, remember, immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, what else does the king do? He sends him with a military escort. He says, I'm not going to just give you a letter that somebody's going to kill you and then read and go, whoops. I'm going to send you with a military escort. You can go in and go through these territories. You can go to the governors of these territories, as he does, present these letters. You are going with my full authority. Do you believe that God can do those kind of things? Do you believe that God wants his people and his church to be these things that are completely unattainable for us, but to be completely attainable for him? You see, 3 times in John's writings in the New Testament that we can ask anything according to the will of God, and he'll do it. But do we? Oh, we ask for things, but do we spend time, as Nehemiah has, this extended time saying, God, what is it that you want? What is it that you want? What is it that you want? Show me and lead me, and then will you do it, Lord? We don't achieve results we think we want in our own lives because too often we don't believe that God can do it. We don't see things happen in our own church because too often we don't believe that God can do it. We don't even ask for it because sometimes it's just too much to imagine of what God can do. But Nehemiah hadn't feared the king. And he wasn't afraid to ask the king because he had asked God first. Then he gets to the assessment. Nehemiah had arrived in Jerusalem. It was a number of months that it took him to get there. It was a long journey. And he gets to Jerusalem, and it's 3 days there. And likely some of that was rest after a long journey. But he didn't tell anybody what was going on. He just said, I'm just going to look around. I'm just going to look around. I'm going to nose around a little bit, see what's happening around here. It was strategic observation. You know, there were some things that he had been told were obvious as he approached the city. You know, they're coming into Jerusalem, and you can see the walls are down. You can see the burned gates. He'd been told by his brother and the others that were with his brother of the condition, but now he was able to see it for himself. He trusted what they said, but you all understand, you know very well that hearing a report is much different than seeing it with your own eyes, and now he's seeing it. And so those first 3 days, he likely just kind of toured around the city. This is a place, remember, he's never been. This exile began 140 years ago. He's never been to this city. He didn't grow up there. He wasn't born there. This was just the home of his people. And so he wants to go. He wants to look. And he probably talked to folks as he was out. And I can imagine how the conversations went. Conversations probably didn't include the broken down walls. Folks probably didn't talk about the condition of the city. Folks probably didn't complain, wishing, well, somebody ought to do something. See, there was probably a lot of evidence, emotional or psychological or whatever you want to call it, evidence of the state of mind of the people living there in Jerusalem. You could probably see despair in their faces. You could probably hear it in their voices. There was no pride in this once great city that had been the crown jewel of God. This has been where he had been, this place where was the center of their faith. And so these simple questions, these simple observations, rather, became more telling than probing questions. He just began to see it. And then he set out at night to check the walls, to do a more thorough inspection, and he looked at the walls really with the eyes of his enemies. What do our enemies see whenever they approach? It says he only took a small group with him, and they went out the west side of the city and went around the southern end of the city and had come up through what we know as the Kidron Valley, along what was left of the city walls, and in that valley, it says that the walls were broken so far down he couldn't just ride along the walls. He had to go farther down into the valley. In fact, whenever you read on into chapter 3, you find out that he doesn't even, when it came time to rebuild the walls, he says, "This is too much rubble. We're not going to rebuild in the same place there. We're going to move this section of wall because it's just so bad here." But he's checking for what are the conditions of the wall. The guys that were with him were probably men who understood construction, men who understood what needed to be done with repairs, or is this a tear down and rebuild, or is there something that we can do? And what about the gates? What do we need to do to remember, Nehemiah is in the palace in Susa. He doesn't probably know much about construction. He's got to take guys with him that know how to build a wall, that know how to do this work. He'd gotten enough of an idea of the scope of work. He didn't even go all the way around the city. He just said, this is as much as I need to see. But why go at night? See, remember, he hasn't told anybody why he's there yet. Hasn't told anybody. He knew better than to ride into town and announce, all right, here's what I'm here to do. He says, no, I need to go in and do some research, do my due diligence. And he'd probably seen some areas of the wall from the inside of the city, and now going out and around the southern end of the city, he could inspect what he couldn't see inside. But then also, if he announces his intentions too soon, too many competing interests get involved. Well, yeah, that wall does need fixed. Hey, can you take care of my part first? Well, no, that part over there is not as important. You don't need to worry about that. Let's concentrate our work over here. Not to mention if he comes in there and announces who he is, what he's been doing. There's spies inside of the city. We know that Sanballat and Tobiah they've at least got people in and around. They know what's going on. Why tell your enemies, hey, this is what we're fixing to do? So, just be prepared. Only after his assessment did Nehemiah share his reason for coming to Jerusalem. In fact, we don't even know, when you look at verses 16 and 17, we don't know exactly if that was an immediate thing. Most likely not. There was probably at least a span of a few days in there for him to kind of gather his thoughts. But he had time. He developed this plan after this assessment before he presented it to the city leaders. Because his assessment needed to be uninfluenced. It needed to be unbiased. You see, those who were already there weren't getting the job done. In fact, most of them probably didn't even see the seriousness of the situation they were in. They saw the broken walls every day. They saw the gates that had been burned 140 years ago, and yet they had done nothing. And so he said, I just don't need to listen on that. They've allowed this to happen. They've allowed issues to linger or deepen. And so his assessment needed to have fresh eyes because they couldn't see what was right in front of them. The same is still true today. We get tunnel visioned. We only see what's right in front of us and not that bigger picture. We miss the overall state of things because we are concerned about our area or something that's important to us. And things being important to us is a great thing. We just need to see the bigger picture. Whole companies are built on coming in and seeing what others don't. It's true in church life. We get used to doing things. We get used to things being a certain way. And we don't realize what may be needed because we're just comfortable with the way it is. And then we resist any change that may be suggested. So Nehemiah here he's done his assessment. He understands what's going on more so than the people who have lived there their whole life. He has been able to come in and see with these fresh eyes. And then there's the call to action. Second half of verse 18 through the end of the chapter, the leaders began to see the need. Because Nehemiah had gone out, he had done his assessment, he had gone out and said, here's the situation. He came back, and when he talked to him, he said, what you all don't realize is what's really going on. You've been blinded because you're just right here in the midst of it all the time, and it happens, and notice he's not critical of them here. He doesn't start finger wagging and say, why didn't you do something? He just says, verse 17, he says, you see the trouble we're in. He called their attention to what they saw every day but failed to recognize. And he doesn't give some rally speech. I mean, Nehemiah, for all of his leadership qualities, doesn't seem to be a big pep-me-up kind of guy. He simply stated clearly the condition of the city and the walls. And then he told them, look, God can do it. Y'all are worried about your enemies. Okay, they're out there. Y'all are worried about the work. It's going to be hard. But Nehemiah says, let me tell you what my God has done already. I heard about things, and I prayed. And then God gave me this opportunity before the most powerful king on the face of this earth. And that king said, yeah, I'll send you. The same one that shut you all down before said, no, I like your idea. I like your plan. Why don't you go and do that? Now, some people will say, well, now, the king at that time, they would have been looking for people to build out basically outposts farther out from their capital to where they could strengthen their kingdom farther out. Who cares? The king agreed to what he did. God moved in him, the same king that had shut it down before, who could have said some 20 years before that, hey, I need a stronger outpost out there because there's a lot of trouble out there. He says, no, I'm going to shut that down. Now he's saying, no, go do what your God has asked you to do and called you to do. And Nehemiah says, it wasn't just that he told me to do it. He gave me letters that I could get through and everything will be fine. He gave me resources that we don't have to go out and scrounge around to find all this stuff. We can go over to the king's forest. All that stuff that you see over there that the king owns, I have access to that. And the king sent me here. Did y'all see me come in here, that military escort? Yeah, they were with me. Not because of me, but because our God moved in the king to do that. He told them what God had done. And this remnant, this faithful group in Jerusalem, certainly wouldn't have expected such support from the king back in Susa, the Persian king. These were people who had been subject to the Persian Empire. And before that, they were subject to the Babylonians. And before that, they were subject to the Assyrians. These were folks for the last 140 years have been under somebody else's thumb. And now Nehemiah stands before them with evidence that God still remembered them. And God was still faithful to who He is and would be faithful to them and to who He had called them to be if they would continue to be faithful to Him. So upon that realization, the decision to begin the work was made. Their eyes had been opened and their faith in the work of God had been restored. And the end of verse 18 says their hands were strengthened to do this good work. Their hands were strengthened to do this good work. The work was going to be hard. The physical toll was going to be enormous. I can't even begin to fathom the amount, that kind of work. And many of you who know the account from Nehemiah know that many of these guys are going to wind up working one-handed. And they're going to be working, with somebody. I mean, they got enemies to worry about. Hey, I may have to stop what I'm doing to go fight and then come back to work. But just in case, I'm going to keep a spear, I'm going to keep a sword in one hand, I'm going to work one-handed, moving blocks to build a wall. It's not going to be easy work. This is going to be back-breaking work. The Scripture says that their hands were strengthened for that work. That only happens when God is working through somebody to accomplish His purposes. And it's a lesson that we all need to learn and we all need to practice. That no matter what size of task I have, if I don't trust God to do it, if He has called me to do it, if I don't trust Him to do it, if I just do it on my own, I'm going to fail every time. Isaiah 40 tells us that youth may become faint and weary, and young men stumble and fall, but those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength and soar on wings like eagles. Run and not become weary. Walk and not be faint. They get their strength from God. And when we do what God has called us to do, according to His way, trusting in Him, saying, God, fill me with your Spirit to do your work, not for my glory, but for yours alone, He will give us that strength. So there was an excitement that began to build to do that work. They said, let's get to work. Let's start rebuilding. But that excitement can only take them so far. It was going to take dedication. It was going to take resolve and determination, commitment, all those, open up the thesaurus, all those synonyms there, that it's going to take all of them. Because hard work was ahead. Hard times were ahead. It was going to take proper focus on, we're not just rebuilding a wall. We're not just trying to protect ourselves. We're trying to bring glory to the Lord, because that's what He's called us to do. Without that focus, they would give in. Their enemies could just overrun them. And those enemies were going to be there, because opposition to the work of God is always there. Don't ever launch into some spiritual work without expecting opposition. If you do, you're fooling yourself. If you don't have some are going to, we need to expect, if you don't have somebody opposed to what you're doing when you're doing the things of the Lord, you're either not doing the things of the Lord or you're not pushing hard enough for it. I'm not talking about trying to steamroll anybody. I'm saying just taking the stand like Nehemiah shows that he fearlessly standing before the king, fearlessly going on this journey that he's sent on. Fearlessly now standing before these other leaders and telling them, I'm here to lead you into something better. And there's people that aren't going to like it, and we see that. We saw it back in verse 10. We see it again in verse 19. The guys mocking him in verse 19 is the same guys mocking him in verse 10. We'll hear from them again later on. I mean, they're just there. And his response, he knows they don't have any real authority, by the way. Those guys that are mocking him are under the same authority of the king of Persia as he is. And his response, the God of the heavens is the one who will grant us success. This ain't about us. This ain't about what I can motivate people to do. It isn't about their physical strength. This is about whether or not God is going to grant us success. And because He had said He would, I believe that He will. The people just needed to be faithful. Needed to be faithful. This is the remnant that He's gone back to. These are the people who were left and the families that they've built after the exile. What happens when opposition comes, though? What happens when opposition comes into your life? What happens when opposition comes into the life of the church? What happens when the mocking comes and the false accusations? What happens when the things that God leads us in are opposed? Do we just quit? Do we give up? Or do we press on? Nehemiah knew that it was the right time for the right work in the right way here. He said it's time to act. He'd spent his time researching. He'd done his due diligence. He'd done his planning. All that began with 4 months of praying on the front end. And he says, now's the time to act. And he'd gone and he had met with the people and he identified with those people. And whenever it came time to tell the truth about their situation, he didn't soft pedal it. This is the reality of the situation. We're in trouble. He said, I'm committed to this action that's necessary. And I know that my God can and will do it because He has done it before. Not because I've seen it happen in other people's lives. He says, I've seen it happen in my life. Nehemiah had asked God first and then the king. Then he went and he assessed the situation and said, now it's time to act. So this morning, let me ask you, what action do you need to take? Not for yourself. Not even necessarily for this church. What action do you need to take to bring glory to God? in your life. Now, that could very directly and very likely should directly affect this church. But not because of the church, but because of bringing glory to God. Is there something in your life that you just, maybe you can look at it and go, you know what, I feel like I'm sitting inside of that city. There have been crumbled walls around me and I haven't seen it. Maybe God's opened your eyes this morning just a little bit. And He's saying, you've been satisfied for too long. What's it going to take now? Are you willing to spend the time with God? Asking Him to do something great in your life, in the life of this church, in the life of this community, because when God begins to do something great in your life, and then in the life of this church, it has to affect this community. What is it that you need to pray? What is it that you need to ask today? What is it that you need to assess in your life today, and what is it that you need to act on in your life today? Our invitation, our time of response, we're going to sing I Love to Tell the Story, hymn number 572. If you have something that you need to or want to talk with me about, pray with me about, I'm going to be right down here. This is just the way we do things here, like most Baptist churches. If you have a decision that you need to make, if you have something that you just have to say, look, I'm not sure what God's doing, but He's begun to open my eyes to some things this morning. I'll be down here, be glad to visit with you, be glad to pray with you. Father, thank you for the opportunity to share your word